Music of the Soul Prelude, Chapter 8. Krista's legs were burning. She'd been holding this wide, low stance for several minutes now, and her legs were quivering. It wasn't as though she was unused to this stance. She had some lessons of martial arts, though never this intense that she could recall. But it had been a while since she had last practiced. Sweat poured down her face. Her breath came labored, even though she did not move. Her stomach felt tight, to the point of nausea, from the effort of holding the stance. Neil circled her, watching her legs quivering, her breath coming in pants, calmly walking around her with his hands behind his back. He had changed from his white robes into loose but sturdy black canvas pants that tied at the waist, and a black long-sleeved shirt that crossed at the chest and stomach and tied at the sides, leaving a V-shaped neckline, and loose enough that it flowed with his every movement, made of the same sturdy material as his pants. She had seen and worn the like herself when she took martial arts lessons, and in fact was wearing the like right now, but in brown. It made her flush wearing it, though, because any time she moved, the shirt seemed to open almost indecently. No one seemed to notice it, so perhaps it was her own perception, being able to look straight down and see what only she herself should be seeing, and believing that others could see it too. There were a handful of other students with her on the training grounds just outside of the infirmary building, which to her mind was an ominous precedence. The others with her also wore the brown uniform that she wore, but far more comfortably than she wore it, and their legs did not quiver. A couple of them began to sweat, but their breath was steady, as though they could be on a pleasant walk, rather than holding a low stance that made her legs ache. They likely had grown up in these lessons and were accustomed to it. But because she was new, Neil seemed to go extra hard on them, on her in particular. Though she hadn't said so yet, she supposed it was because she was an outsider that he was being so hard on her. Just as the Asian boy had told her he would be. He never did give his name. "Krista, watch your breathing and stop feeding your horse. Your stance is too wide," Neil snapped at her. "Everyone, we will hold this stance another 5 minutes until Krista can hold her stance right." The other students with her groaned their disapproval, Krista joining them for an entirely different reason. She narrowed her stance and tried to force her breath to steady, though her legs did not want to hold her up, and her breath did not want to slow. She knew the others hated her for being an outsider, and now they would hate her more for causing them so much trouble. "Neil-sensei," she panted, knowing it would earn her punishment and not caring. It was ridiculous to punish the others because she couldn't get it right. "Krista, you know better. This better be good, or you will owe me 50 push-ups and 25 monkey drills," Neil said sternly. Even the other students seemed surprised at this. He must not normally be this stern. "Please allow the rest to go on to their normal practice," she said deferentially as she could muster, though her voice came more in grunts than anything. "It is not their fault that I am not doing this right." "How noble of you," Neil said, not smiling, but a glint of amusement glistened in his azure eyes. "I can understand your sentiment. However, students are supposed to help one another, not bully one another, and I will not have them put in their minds that they are above you or you below them. You will all do your classes together and the same, because you are all on the same level, no matter who you are or where you are from. Yes, that means you too, Sebastian. I see you back there glaring. You can do 25 monkey drills for that. Anyone else have a problem?" Krista, being in the front row, could not see anyone giving assent, nor could she see Sebastian, whoever he was, doing monkey drills. But they must have, because Krista heard a thump as the boy dropped to the ground, and Neil nodded his head in satisfaction and continued watching them. Usually, Krista had found that being in the front row of class was a favored place, a place where you could see the dry erase board better and hear the teacher better. However, in this case, everyone wanted the back row, because the teacher could not see you as clearly or catch you in your misdeeds as clearly. Too, Neil seemed especially focused on watching her, looking for any minor infraction to punish everyone with. She wanted to growl to herself at how unfair that was, but she knew that if she did, he would hear her and punish everyone more. Neil Sensei, she said once more, earning a hard-eyed glare from Neil. I understand everyone being on equal terms, but there is no need to punish all for the infractions of one. They are not responsible for my behavior. You will stand out, won't you? He growled at her. 50 push-ups, 25 monkey drills, and 50 jumping jacks, since you seem to have so much energy to argue with me. Everyone else can do 50 push-ups with you. Yes, including you, Sebastian, after you finish those monkey drills. I only counted 15 from you. Get going. This caused the other students to grumble more, and she could feel them glaring at her, like daggers that should be placed between her shoulder blades. She had already faced some amount of bullying from the other students, usually people tripping her up or isolating her during mealtimes, occasionally with a jab at her weight or her birth parents. And she knew she was in for more after class. Come to think of it, this class was comprised of many of her bullies, and only a few who had yet to bully her. Maybe that was the point of Neil punishing them all, letting them all know that they had no place bullying someone who was on the same level as them, whether or not they saw her as an equal with them. She should have thought of that and mentally kicked herself for speaking out like that, though part of her still felt justified in doing so. Bullies or not, it was not fair to punish them for something they did not do. Krista got on hands and knees, grunting with each modified push-up. She had been unable to perform a normal push-up due to her weight, as sweat trickled down her forehead and dripped from the tip of her nose. Her arms screamed with the effort of pushing her up repeatedly, especially after having to do so already for warm-ups, among other exercises. She had no idea how she was going to complete 50 of them, when everyone else was doing 2 or 3 push-ups to her one, when her arms with each push tried to refuse to work. She did find it easier to exhale while pushing up and inhale while coming down, as though sucking herself towards the ground and blowing herself back off the ground, but it was still difficult. Everyone finished with their push-ups, even Sebastian, though he was the last of them to do so. She could hear the rustling of his shirt and pants as he stood up, long before Krista did. If her face could go any more red than it currently was from exertion, it would have from sheer shame. She was ashamed of her body, how it was so huge, how she seemed to have no control over her appetite, how she never seemed to have will or energy to exercise. She supposed that was one benefit of her kidnapping and training here. Her meals were regulated, and whether or not she had will or energy, she got exercise. Even if it did mean she was frequently hungry because the meals were smaller than she was accustomed to, and strangely lacking meat, and tired all the time. The last was not unusual for her, though. Even before coming here, she had been tired all of the time. She tried to see it as a benefit, though deep down she was more miserable than before, and that was saying something. At home she'd been miserable all the time, afraid to be happy because she knew that as soon as something good would happen, something small would happen at home, and her grandfather would blow up at her again. She wouldn't admit to anyone but herself, but suicide plagued her mind constantly, even in her dreams, and she felt no worth to herself or her own life. At least with her training lately, she hadn't had time to contemplate the various ways she could end herself. The song came to mind, but she couldn't remember it, and it had not come up again since that day at the beach. Busy or not, it did not seem to stop her other symptoms, such as panic attacks that she kept to herself, often running off to the bathroom when she could to hide her gasping breath, the tears streaming down her face, or her moans that she was unable to stop as she rocked back and forth in the small, one-toilet room with a simple white wash basin and no mirror. It did not stop her from thinking altogether. It did not stop the racing thoughts, the hurt that she constantly felt inside her chest, nor did it stop those rare occasions where she felt odd, like she was watching herself from a distance. The bullying, of course, made all of this worse, and though meditation helped for a time, it usually returned minutes later when one of her bullies would poke fun at her or get her into trouble. She had known for a long time there was something wrong with her head if she was considering suicide all the time, but she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone at home because she didn't want to worry them. Neither did she want them to stop her if she finally committed to an attempt. She knew she needed therapy, but did not trust therapists, not after what one of them did to her family when she was young. She tried not to think about that situation very much. She also knew that much of her problems stemmed from the abuse she had suffered at home. Oh, it had never been physical, unless one counted spanking, and even then the wooden paddle that had been used on her and her brother had mysteriously disappeared one day after a particularly painful spanking. She and her brother had made it disappear. But the shouting, the name-calling, the demeaning, telling them that they were lazy, stupid, useless, worthless, that they would never amount to anything, that they were unlovable, was more than enough. True, it wasn't constant abuse 24 hours a day. There were good days when their grandfather would surprise them with a treat, though he still never told them when they did a good job or that he was proud of them. Their grandmother had been a counterbalance to the abuse by telling them that she loved them and was proud of them for good grades. They even got interesting stories of their grandfather's youth that were both funny and educational, and because of that, she now had a love of old stories. But the good days were far outnumbered by the bad, overwhelmed by the bad, so that the good days were harder to remember than the bad ones. She also secretly harbored resentment towards her grandfather for treating them so poorly simply because he could not control his temper, which only got worse after her grandmother had died only a year previous. She should have been glad to get away from all of that, but being in this place where she knew no one and trusted no one, and no one trusted her, was frightening. Too, they were still her family, and though she did not like them or like being around them, she still did not hate them. Krista was suddenly shaken from her depressing reverie when someone tapped her on the shoulder. She looked up to see Neil staring at her, his handsome face blank and unreadable. That was more than 50. You can skip the monkey drills, but you still owe me 50 jumping jacks, he told her. Krista realized her breath was coming ragged, and she could not have pushed herself up with her arms no matter how hard she tried. She had to roll onto her side, using one arm to prop herself up and utilizing a different muscle group to do so, just to stand. They didn't want to come up for jumping jacks either, but at least those used a different muscle group in her arms and shoulders, so she did manage that. Her legs still didn't want to move, though, after holding that stance for so long, but she forced them to. By now, everyone had gone back to their stance that they had been holding before. Some of them began to quiver at the leg now, and all of them that were in position to see her without moving their head glared daggers at her. She wanted to sigh, but her breath was too quick and ragged from exercise to do so. She was so tired that her vision began to darken around the edges, but she pushed on anyway, even though she felt like she would simultaneously vomit and pass out. Perhaps it was her exhaustion that distracted her. Perhaps her own thoughts that she tried to push away while somehow also focusing on them to take her mind off of the suffering her body was experiencing. Either way, she felt something strange, but she didn't know what it was, and she was too focused on other problems to really give it any thought. It should have been a forewarning, for only a moment later, something latched onto her left ankle and pulled hard, causing her to fall flat on her face. Several of the students there snickered viciously, particularly when she forced herself to hands and knees, still gasping for air as blood flowed down her face from both nostrils. The damn thing always had bled too easily, and never lightly. Satisfied now? Neil said calmly, though his tone sounded dangerous to her. No one else oddly seemed to catch on to it. Maybe it was because she was used to hearing a variety of rage, including a cold one. Either way, she tried to scoot back on her knees as she pinched just below the bridge of her nose to stop the bleeding. Crimson stained the hard-packed dirt underneath them, where she had not been quick enough to stop the blood, and she was afraid she would be punished for that, too. You know better, he continued. You all do. I'm disappointed in all of you. I should send a lot of you off to Camille for penance, unless the perpetrator would like to step forward and confess. For a moment there was silence as faces turned pale. No one wanted to be summoned to Camille for penance. She was usually fair, at least with those who were not considered outsiders, but she was very firm and had a strong arm. Krista also knew that whoever had tripped her would face the same hazing as her if they didn't step forward, but if they did, no matter what punishment they got, they would be seen as a hero for putting her in her place. Then, a short, pale-haired girl with a doll face, two people down the line from her right, stepped forward, her pale face going paler at the thought of punishment, but her face set determinedly. "It was me, Neil-sensei," she said, staring forward defiantly. "Thank you, Sandra, for your honesty. You will submit yourself to Camille and tell her I said you are to be punished harshly for making another student bleed. The rest of you will do 100 push-ups and 50 monkey drills for covering for her." "Don't look so surprised. I felt all of you touch your power," Neil said sternly. "Krista, you're dismissed for today. Frankly, I don't think you could even stand right now, let alone finish your jumping jacks or the rest of class. Go to the infirmary and get yourself cleaned up." Krista barely heard everyone else moaning to themselves as they got down on the ground for their push-ups, as she wobbled to her feet, using one hand to pinch her nose shut and hopefully stop the bleeding. She definitely felt their glares on her back, though, as she stumbled towards the long building just to the west of the training grounds that was basically a Quonset hut made of steel. She actually looked forward to talking to Lillian, one of the two medics that worked in the infirmary. Adrian was nice enough, or at the very least treated her with indifference rather than outright animosity. But Lillian reminded her a lot of her own grandmother, compassionate, kind, fair, and caring. The biggest difference was that Lillian wasn't afraid to give a tongue lashing to those she saw as being foolish or abusive, and she knew if Lillian got wind that the girl, Sandra, she thought her name was, had caused her nose to bleed, Sandra would see only the slowest and most painful means of healing from whatever penance she received for causing another student to bleed. She also knew that if Lillian found out it was Sandra who caused it, Sandra would think it was Krista herself who told her, so she decided not to tell her the whole truth. She didn't need any more trouble with bullies than she already had. Hachiro grunted, his arms tired and quivering, as he worked through his push-ups. He could have smiled to himself for getting away with what he had done, but he knew that would single him out, particularly since everyone else was less than happy at the moment. Inwardly, though, he laughed to himself. Sandra always had been a bully, particularly one who sought to be a popular bully by picking on outsiders, or even near outsiders, to be called a hero by those who had been there for generations. She had done him a favor, really, by taking the blame, which he knew she would do even if it meant the sore bottom for a while. He had counted on it, really. Putting an idiot and an outsider in their place and getting away with it made his work out that much easier to get through, particularly since no one would have even suspected him, not with Sandra acting the scapegoat.